we spend so much time thinking about, our outward health, the things we can see and feel.
Right.
But today we're going on a journey into this hidden universe inside all of us. It's our gut microbiome.
Absolutely.
And it's teeming with trillions of these tiny organisms,
Yeah.
And we're really just beginning to uncover just how profoundly they influence everything from our digestion to our long-term well-being.
Yeah, across the lifespan. Potentially.
Exactly. And that's what I think is so fascinating. Have you ever stopped to consider how these microscopic inhabitants could be actually shaping your health differently at different ages?
I think that's a great question, and it's a perfect one to tee up what we're going to be diving into today.
Okay, cool.
We're really going to be focusing on this link between the specific communities of bacteria in your gut.
Right.
What we call these microbiome profiles.
Yeah.
And how they relate to your metabolic health as you go through life's different stages, from preteen all the way to older adulthood.
So to guide us through this really intricate relationship, we have a super interesting piece of research.
Yeah.
It was published in the Lancet Regional Health Europe.
Great journal.
It's called Association Between Gut Microbiome Profiles and Host Metabolic Health Across the Life Course, a population-based study.
I love that they looked at the whole life course.
I know. Isn't that cool? And so they took this really broad look at gut microbiomes.
Yeah.
Thousands of individuals in the Netherlands across a huge age range.
It's an incredible study population that they had access to.
Yeah.
So the researchers actually brought together data from 3 distinct Dutch population studies.
Okay.
The Generation R study, which focused on pre-adolescents.
Okay.
The Rotterdam study, which followed older adults. And then the Lifelines Deep study, which included adults kind of in that middle age range.
Gotcha.
And so by examining these 3 different ages, they wanted to see, okay, well, how might the influence of the gut microbiome on metabolic health change over time?
Yeah, does it shift? Does it evolve?
Right, as we age, exactly.
So that's our mission today, is to distill the most important takeaways from this research.
Yeah.
And try to make it, clear and relevant for you, the listener. So we want you to walk away with a solid understanding of how your gut microbiome relates to things like, weight, blood sugar, cholesterol.
The things we think about.
The things we think about at different points in your life without getting totally bogged down in scientific jargon.
That's the goal.
Yeah, so a key concept we'll be unpacking is this idea of distinct microbiome clusters that the study identified.
Oh, yeah.
Think of them as these different, general types of gut microbial communities.
Right.
And we're going to talk about how they're linked to metabolic health.
Like different patterns.
Right.
You see these patterns emerge.
Okay, so let's dig deeper into how this study was actually conducted.
Yeah, well, first off, the scale of this research is impressive.
I was really impressed by that.
They looked at almost 1,500 pre-adolescents.
Wow.
Around 10 years old, over 1,200 older adults.
Okay.
With an average age of about 63, and then over 1,100 middle-aged adults, around 45 on average.
Gotcha.
And so this wide range of participants across the lifespan, it really gives the study a lot of power to detect these consistent patterns that might hold true across different ages.
Okay, cool. And the way they analyzed all of this microbial data was also really interesting to me. So
I think so too.
They didn't just look at, individual bacteria in isolation.
Right.
They used the technique called k-means clustering to identify these distinct patterns or clusters the entire gut microbiome within each age group.
Right, like the whole community.
Right. It's almost like taking a snapshot of everyone's unique gut microbial makeup and then sorting those snapshots into different albums based on their similarities.
Yeah, I love that analogy.
Yeah.
Like looking at the whole picture, not just the individual pieces.
Exactly. So then once they had these microbiome clusters identified, they investigated how these different, microbial albums correlated with a whole host of metabolic traits.
Yeah, they looked at so many things.
Yeah, and so these are things that I think a lot of our listeners are going to be familiar with because they talk about them all the time.
Right.
Things like BMI, body fat percentage, levels of sugar and fats in the blood.
Yep.
And they even looked at the risk of hardening of the arteries,
right,
which is atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, ASCVD.
You got it.
In the older participants, they also looked at lifestyle factors like, what people were eating, how active they were.
Right, what medications they were taking.
The use of various medications.
Trying to control for all these different factors.
Yeah, exactly.
That might be influencing these things.
And I think what's really key here and what's so fascinating is that unlike a lot of studies that focus on people who are already sick, this one looked at a general population across the lifespan.
That's what makes this so unique and so powerful.
And it gives us, I think, a much broader understanding
Yeah.
of how our gut microbes and our metabolic health are connected in everyday life, not just in the context of disease.
Exactly. And what they found is really interesting.
Yeah.
So across all three age groups,
Uh-huh.
the kids, the middle-aged adults, and the seniors,
Okay.
they consistently found two main types of gut microbiome profiles.
Like archetypes almost.
Exactly. And they label them cluster U, which stood for unhealthier,
Okay.
and cluster H for healthier.
I like that.
And they base this labeling on the overall metabolic health of the individuals.
Gotcha. So the people who had these particular profiles.
Right, exactly.
Okay, cool. So let's paint a picture of this unhealthier cluster U profile.
Okay.
What are some of the consistent characteristics that were observed?
Well, one of the most consistent findings was that individuals in cluster U tended to have just a less diverse community of microbes in their gut
Okay.
overall. And you can think about your gut like a rainforest.
Yeah.
The more different species of plants and animals you have, the more resilient and stable that ecosystem is.
Right.
And so when that diversity decreases, it can create opportunities for less beneficial bacteria to maybe become a little bit more dominant
Okay.
and potentially disrupt the balance.
Yeah.
That leads to a healthy metabolism.
So a less diverse microbiome is potentially less resilient.
And they actually measured this diversity using what's called the Shannon Index,
Okay.
which was consistently lower in the U clusters
Across all three age groups.
across all three age groups.
And what about specific types of bacteria?
Right.
Well, there are certain bugs that seem to be more prevalent in this cluster U.
Yes, so they found higher levels of a bacteria called Streptococcus
Okay.
and Fusicatinibacter
Okay.
in the cluster U profiles across all age groups.
Gotcha.
And on the flip side, they consistently observed lower levels of a bacteria called Prevotella 9
Okay.
and a group known as Christensen-Alesi R7 group in these unhealthier clusters.
So those were lower in the unhealthier cluster.
Right.
Okay, that's so interesting how these particular bacterial groups seem to track with the overall healthier or unhealthier profile,
I know, it's fascinating, right?
regardless of age.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just about the bacteria themselves.
No.
The study also found some links between these clusters and other indicators of health,
Of course.
like lifestyle and things like that.
Yeah, so people in cluster U consistently showed associations with a higher percentage of body fat,
Okay.
higher levels of triglycerides.
Which are a type of fat found in the blood.
Exactly.
Okay.
More frequent use of various medications,
Okay.
and even a trend towards lower socioeconomic status
Interesting.
across all three of the studied groups.
Yeah.
So this really paints a picture of a gut microbiome profile that often goes hand in hand with other signs that we typically associate with poorer metabolic health.
It seems to be a pretty good indicator, or at least a correlate.
Yeah, a strong correlate.
Okay, so now let's switch gears and talk about cluster H.
Okay, the healthier one?
Yeah, the healthier microbiome profile.
Right.
What were the key features that characterize this group?
So in contrast to cluster U, the healthier cluster H was generally characterized by just a richer, more varied community of gut microbes.
Okay, so that higher diversity.
Exactly that diversity that we were talking about.
Yeah, okay.
That was apparent across all the different age groups they studied.
Mm-hmm.
And as you might expect, individuals in this cluster tended to have better metabolic health indicators
Makes sense.
on average.
Okay, so we're seeing this recurring theme where a more diverse gut microbial community,
Yes.
along with that specific mix of bacteria that you talked about,
Right.
seems to be associated with better metabolic health.
Throughout life.
Right. Okay, so now let's get into some of the specific observations the study made.
Okay, let's break it down.
Within each age group, starting with the pre-adolescents,
Okay.
in the Generation R study, what were the findings there?
So in the pre-adolescent group, the kids whose gut microbiome profiles put them in that unhealthier cluster,
Okay.
they tended to have higher BMIs,
Okay.
a greater percentage of body fat,
Uh-huh.
elevated levels of triglycerides, and C-reactive protein, or CRP,
And CRP is...
which is a marker in the blood that indicates inflammation in the body,
Gotcha.
and also higher systolic blood pressure,
Okay.
which is the top number in your blood pressure reading.
So basically, all the things that you don't want to be high
Yeah, pretty much.
were high in this group.
Exactly.
Was there any other factors that seemed to be linked to this less healthy microbiome profile in the pre-adolescent group?
They also observed an association with lower levels of education in the mothers
Interesting.
and having a migration background
Okay.
in this younger cohort.
So socioeconomic factors already seem to be playing a role,
Potentially, yeah, it seems like it.
even at that young age.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the older adults in the Rotterdam study. What did they find there?
So in the older adults, the patterns were remarkably consistent.
Interesting.
with what they saw in the younger group.
Okay.
So again, cluster U was linked to higher BMI, a larger waist-to-hip ratio.
Which is another indicator of body fat distribution.
Exactly where you're carrying your weight.
Okay.
Greater overall body fat percentage, higher levels of triglycerides, glucose, blood sugar, and insulin,
Wow.
as well as increased insulin resistance, meaning
Mhm.
their bodies weren't responding as effectively to insulin.
Okay.
They also had higher systolic blood pressure
Okay.
and a higher prevalence of both type 2 diabetes and hypertension or high blood pressure in this group.
So really a much greater risk or prevalence, I guess, of those metabolic disorders.
Yes, exactly.
Were there any lifestyle factors that stood out in this group?
The older adults in cluster U reported having diets that were considered to be of poorer quality
Okay.
based on standard dietary scores, and they also had higher rates of smoking.
Yeah.
Additionally, they were more frequently using proton pump inhibitors, or PPIs,
Well, sure.
which are medications to reduce stomach acid,
Okay.
and lipid-lowering medications like statins.
Interesting.
And just like in the other age groups, they exhibited that significantly lower overall microbiome diversity.
So again, less diversity seems to be a marker of this unhealthier profile.
Seems like it, yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to the final group. The adults in the Lifelines Deep study, did they show similar trends?
Largely, yes. They mirrored the findings in both the pre-adolescents and the older adults.
Okay.
So again, cluster U is associated with higher BMI,
Okay.
higher levels of triglycerides,
Okay.
CRP,
Okay.
and insulin, as well as increased insulin resistance,
Okay.
along with lower levels of HDL cholesterol.
Which is often called the good cholesterol.
Exactly.
Okay.
And similar to the older adults, they also found more frequent smoking
Uh-huh.
and a higher rate of lipid-lowering medication use
Gotcha.
among the adults who belong to cluster U.
Okay.
And, again, lower microbiome diversity.
Was a significant characteristic.
Yeah, it seems to be a recurring theme.
Yeah, and so as we're seeing, across all these different stages of life, from childhood to middle age to older adulthood,
Right.
we're seeing this consistent picture emerge.
Yeah.
A less diverse gut microbiome,
Yeah.
often with an increased presence of certain bacteria and a lower presence of others,
Right.
is associated with a generally less favorable metabolic health profile.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable how these patterns seem to hold up.
Across such a wide age range, I was really struck by that.
Yeah, me too. And I think what's particularly noteworthy is that even with these, biological differences between these age groups, the study identified 6 specific bacterial genera
Oh, wow.
that showed consistent directional changes in their abundance between cluster U and cluster H across all 3 cohorts.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it is. And it suggests that these particular types of bacteria might be playing a more fundamental role in our metabolic health.
Throughout life.
Throughout life, exactly.
I love that. Okay, so we have to name these 6 bacteria. What were they?
So the bacterial genera that showed this consistent pattern were Streptococcus
Okay, we talked about that one.
and Fusicatinibacter, which were more abundant in that unhealthier cluster U across all ages.
Okay.
And then conversely, Prevotella 9 and Christenstalaceae R7 group were consistently less abundant in cluster U.
Okay.
2 other genera, Blauschia and Anaerosteps,
Okay.
also showed consistent trends, although in the pre-adolescents, the direction of the association for these 2 was a little bit less clear.
Okay.
But I think this overlap really hints that these specific microbes might have a more universal influence on our metabolic well-being.
It makes you wonder, what are they doing?
I know, right?
What are they doing in
More research is needed.
That's causing these differences.
But it's so fascinating.
Now, the study didn't just look at these microbiome clusters in isolation, right?
Right, they wanted to validate these findings.
Okay.
So they also did their own clustering analysis.
Okay.
But this time, they grouped participants based directly on their metabolic health measurements.
Things like...
Things like BMI,
Okay.
blood pressure readings, cholesterol levels.
Okay.
And this allowed them to identify their own healthy and unhealthy metabolic clusters based on these direct indicators.
Okay.
And then they compared these 2 sets of clusters,
Right.
the ones based on the gut microbiome and the ones based on the direct metabolic measurements,
To see if they lined up.
to see if they overlapped. And they did.
Okay.
They found that individuals who were classified as being in that microbiome cluster U had significantly higher odds of also being classified in the metabolically unhealthy cluster based on those measurements.
Across all 3 studies.
Across all 3 studies.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it is.
It really, I think, reinforces that the gut microbiome isn't just a passive bystander.
Right. It's not just along for the ride.
It's actively involved in this metabolic well-being.
A player, for sure.
And they even, for the older adults in the Rotterdam study, took this a step further and looked at the connection to the risk of developing cardiovascular disease.
Right.
So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so given the impact of cardiovascular disease in older populations,
Yeah.
they wanted to investigate whether these different microbiome clusters
Yeah.
were associated with the likelihood of developing ASCVD
Oh, over.
over a follow-up period of about 6.5 years on average.
Okay.
And so what they found was that while the actual number of new ASCVD cases during the follow-up didn't reach what we consider to be statistically significant
Okay.
after adjusting for other risk factors,
Okay.
they did find that those individuals who were in that unhealthy microbiome cluster U had a significantly higher estimated 5-year risk of developing ASCVD
Okay.
based on these established risk prediction models.
So the risk calculator.
Exactly. And the average estimated 5-year risk was higher
Yeah.
in cluster U compared to cluster H,
So,
suggesting that an unhealthy gut microbiome profile in older adults might be a signal,
yeah, like an early warning sign.
an early warning sign, exactly,
Interesting.
or a contributing factor.
Okay, cool. So we've talked about the characteristics of these microbiome clusters.
Yeah.
What factors did the study identify as being associated with an individual, ending up in that unhealthier cluster U?
So they explored a range of factors,
Okay.
and it varied a little bit depending on age, but there was some common thread.
Okay.
In the pre-adolescent group being of Asian ethnicity,
Okay.
having a higher percentage of body fat,
Uh-huh.
and having a mother with a lower level of education
Okay.
were all associated with a higher likelihood of belonging to that unhealthier cluster.
Interesting.
In the older adults being male,
Okay.
being a current smoker,
Uh-huh.
the use of PPIs,
Okay.
having a high percentage of body fat,
Okay.
high levels of triglycerides in the blood, and having a lower level of education were all associated
Gotcha.
with the unhealthier microbiome cluster.
And for the adults?
In that middle-aged group,
Okay.
obesity, having high triglyceride level, and again, a lower level of education were associated.
Gotcha.
And surprisingly, younger age seemed to be somewhat protective against being in the U cluster.
Oh, that's interesting.
I know, although the reasons for that would need more investigation.
Right, for sure. But it is interesting that certain things like higher body fat and lower education
Right.
popped up across multiple age groups.
Yeah.
And, it highlights this complex interplay between
Right.
our biology, our lifestyle choices, and these microbes.
And it's important to keep in mind they also observed some associations with more technical aspects
Oh, right.
of how the samples were collected and processed,
Okay.
like the time of year the sample was taken, how long it took to reach the lab,
Okay.
the specific batches used for DNA extraction and sequencing.
Right.
This just highlights how crucial the methodology is in microbiome research
Absolutely.
to ensure the reliability of the findings.
It's a reminder that studying the microbiome is complex.
It is a complex system.
There's so many variables.
So many variables to consider.
Okay, so as we bring this all together, what are the major implications of this study?
Well, I think this study provides compelling evidence
Yeah.
that our gut microbiome profiles are linked to our metabolic health across our lifespan,
Yeah.
not just at one point in time.
Right.
It really suggests that the composition of our gut microbial community could serve as an indicator of our overall metabolic status.
So that opens up some really exciting possibilities, doesn't it?
It does.
Like this idea of potentially being able to influence and target the gut microbiome
Right.
as a strategy to improve metabolic health through diet lifestyle or even more targeted interventions.
Exactly. And the researchers highlighted that childhood and adolescence might be a really critical window
Okay.
for interventions that could have long-lasting benefits.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about, right?
That what's happening in our gut in our younger years could have these far-reaching effects.
Could set the stage
Yeah.
for our later life.
And they did point out some limitations of this study.
Of course.
So let's hear about those.
They noted that their analysis relied on a specific type of genetic sequencing
Okay.
called 16S rRNA sequencing,
Okay.
which gives a good overview
Yeah.
of the types of bacteria,
Uh-huh.
but it doesn't give us the most granular detail down to the species and strains.
Gotcha.
Also, in some of the study groups, the dietary information
Yeah.
was collected a few years before the stool samples were taken,
Okay.
so they couldn't account for those more recent changes.
Right.
They also lacked data on infants and the very elderly,
Yeah.
which are obviously important periods.
Huge changes happening in the microbiome.
And it's important to remember these studies were conducted in the Netherlands,
Okay.
so the findings might not be directly generalizable.
To other populations.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what kind of follow-up research do they suggest?
They emphasized the need for future research
Yeah.
that uses more advanced sequencing techniques
Okay.
to get a more fine-grained understanding.
Yeah.
They also suggested animal studies,
Okay.
like those involving fecal microbiota transplantation,
Yeah.
as well as human intervention trials, to
Yeah.
really establish those cause and effect relationships
Yeah, that's what we need.
between the microbiome and metabolic health.
This has been such a fascinating look into this really complex world of the gut microbiome.
It's an amazing world, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, it's like a universe
It is.
inside of us.
A whole ecosystem.
And so for our listener, the key takeaway, I think, is this. The trillions of microorganisms in your gut are not just passive bystanders.
Right.
They're actively and intricately linked to your metabolic well-being.
Uh-huh.
And this connection runs across all stages of
From
life.
the beginning to the end.
And what's particularly striking to me is this consistency of certain types of bacteria
Right.
that are associated with healthier or less healthy metabolic states across these diverse age groups.
Yeah, and it really suggests that there are some fundamental links between these specific microbes
Ah,
and how our bodies process energy
right.
and maintain metabolic balance.
So here's a thought for you to consider.
Okay, I like it.
Given that the composition of your gut microbiome is influenced by things that you can control,
Yes.
like your diet and lifestyle,
Uh-huh.
what small change that you consider exploring in your own life?
Yeah.
Not as medical advice, of course,
Right.
but as a way to just, explore your own
A
well-being.
little self-experimentation,
Yeah, exactly.
basically.
So maybe reflect on how your dietary choices,
Especially early in life.
especially in your younger years, might be influencing your gut health and your long-term metabolic well-being.
It's never too late to start thinking about it.
And this is a rapidly advancing field of research.
It is?
And the ongoing efforts are, I think, continually revealing the profound influence that this has,
For
for
sure.
sure, on our overall health.
More to come.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
My pleasure.
Until our next exploration, keep on learning.